For participation activity number 8, they want you to look at graphs and kind of talk about how they behave. And there's two types of behavior, local and end. Local is kind of like around the origin. Now, sometimes they're not right at the origin, but this one is. And then end behavior is how the graph finishes, but at both ends, if that makes any sense. Okay, so our problem on this one, the one they're giving us, is the equation of f of x equals 1 over x squared. And there was actually a picture of it. It was this right here. That was in Mobius in the reading and participation activity. So I just took a screenshot of it and put it right there. But when you're looking at 1 over x squared, x can be any number in the world except for 0. Because if x is 0, you would have 1 divided by 0, and, that is undefined. If I grab my calculator and hit 1 divided by 0, my calculator gives me an error message. That's because it's impossible to divide by 0. So, when I'm looking at what's happening in my graph, 0 is right here. That's where 0 is on the x-axis. And when you're getting closer and closer to that, let me grab, we'll go with bright green here. When you're trying to move to the right on the graph and you're approaching, okay, you're moving along the x-axis and you're getting closer and closer and closer to x being 0. What happens to your graph is your graph starts to move away from the x-axis and run along the y-axis, and it gets closer and closer to the y-axis, but it never touches it. So eventually it ends up, at positive infinity. I don't know why I wrote a negative there. So when they say as x approaches 0 from the negative side, because this is going towards negative infinity and this is going towards positive infinity. So we're approaching it from the negative side. Our x gets closer and closer to 0, but every one of these points on the graph, its y-coordinate gets closer and closer to being infinity. So you would end up clicking on this button here so that an infinity symbol shows up. Let me just jump back to here. There it is. Okay, so as x approaches 0, boop, we get infinity, and just click on the infinity symbol. Then we're going to say as x approaches 0 from the positive side. Now let me go back to my picture. On the positive side, and I'll try to color code this, I just did negative, okay? So now we're going to look at it from the positive side. This is the positive side. So as we're moving here and getting closer and closer and closer and closer to 0, what is the graph doing? From this side, the graph is, again, turning and running along the y-axis, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And it, too, is heading towards positive infinity. So I would need to put a 0 here and positive infinity in that box. Let me jump back and take care of that. Once again, we're going to a positive infinity. Now it talks about end behavior. Okay, so to do the end behavior, I did this picture again. All right. End behavior is when it's moving away from 0. So you can see that it says right here, as x approaches negative infinity, that means, again, you're starting at 0, but you're going this way. What is the graph doing as you're going towards negative infinity? The graph, I think I've used all these colors. I'll just go back to pink again. The graph is actually going downhill and running along the x-axis, and it's actually getting closer and closer and closer to being on the x-axis. So the y-coordinate is getting closer and closer and closer to being 0. Like, for example, if you're at this point right here, here's your x-coordinate, here's your y-coordinate. That point is at like negative, we'll say 1/3, and the y-coordinate is 3. But when you get to here, that has an x-coordinate of -3 and a y-coordinate of like, I don't know, like 1/8, right? When you get way out here, it's getting, let's see, 6, 7, 8. That would be x is -8, but I'm getting closer and closer. I'm getting smaller and smaller. It'd be like 1/20th or something. This guy would then go to like 1/30th and like 1/100, then like 1/1000. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's getting closer and closer to 0. And the same thing happens on the other side. As x approaches positive infinity, so you're starting when x is 0, but then you're going to 1, x is 2, x is 3, x is 4, x is 5. You keep going to positive infinity this way, and your graph, your y-coordinates, which started at positive infinity this way, the y's are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and closer to that x-axis, so they're getting closer and closer to being 0. Hope that makes sense. So let me go back and on both of these it was 0. So stick in 0. And I'm pretty sure I got to type all of them in. Yes, I do. I've got them all in there. Positive infinity, 0, 0. How did I do? And how did I do? Did I get them all? Yep. Green, 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 green. And then here's the feedback that they give you. So I hope that made sense. You're like, what is the y-coordinate doing as the x-coordinate is either, getting closer and closer to 0 or closer and closer to positive or negative infinity?